May 8th, 1945. Munich, Germany. The war in Europe was officially over. American and German officers were now gathering to complete the final surrender procedures. But even in this moment of defeat and closure, the atmosphere inside the room was anything but calm. It was tense, heavy, and filled with silent hostility. Armed guards stood on both sides, watching every movement carefully, ready for anything that could go wrong. Among the German officers present was a man who refused to accept defeat in silence or dignity. Generalmajor Kurt von Gotberg stood across from the American staff, tall, rigid, and aristocratic. His Wehrmacht uniform was still perfectly maintained despite the collapse of Germany around him. He had commanded panzer divisions on the Eastern Front and had survived some of the most brutal battles of the war, including Stalingrad. His hand rested close to his sidearm, and his posture made it clear that he was not there in acceptance, but in resistance. When General George S. Patton entered the room, von Gotberg did not stand. He did not salute. He remained completely still, deliberately ignoring military protocol. Patton's aide began presenting the final surrender terms. The German general listened carefully, expression unchanged, cold and controlled. Then, in perfect English and loud enough for everyone to hear, he finally spoke. He said that the Americans had fought a safe war. That they had arrived too late. That they had never faced the kind of destruction and suffering the Germans had endured in Russia. He went further, claiming that calling themselves warriors was an insult to those who had truly bled and suffered. His words were sharp, deliberate, and meant to provoke. Immediately, American guards reacted. Rifles were raised. Tension exploded inside the room. But before anyone could escalate further, Patton raised his hand and calmly said, "Stop." He was not angry. In fact, he was smiling slightly. Because George Patton had been waiting for a moment like this his entire life. To understand what was about to unfold, it is important to understand the situation in May 1945. Germany had surrendered unconditionally just 2 days earlier. The Third Reich had collapsed completely, but the administrative process of surrender was massive and complicated. Millions of German soldiers still had to be processed. Weapons had to be collected. Units had to be officially disbanded. Documents had to be signed, verified, and recorded. Across occupied Germany, the Americans set up processing centers where German officers would arrive, formally surrender their command, hand over their weapons, and then be transported to prisoner of war camps. It was meant to be orderly, structured, and professional. A final administrative step in a war that had already been decided. But not every German officer accepted that reality. Generalmajor Kurt von Gotberg was 48 years old, a Prussian aristocrat and career military officer. He had joined the Wehrmacht in 1935 and steadily climbed through its ranks, eventually commanding armored panzer units. By 1943, he was fighting on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union. He had witnessed extreme conditions, the freezing retreat from Moscow, the devastating destruction at Kursk, and the horror of Stalingrad, where he narrowly escaped encirclement. Von Gotberg believed deeply in one idea. Not necessarily loyalty to Hitler or the Nazi Party, but the belief that the German military was superior. He believed German officers were the finest soldiers in the world. In his view, Germany had not been defeated because it was weaker, but because it was overwhelmed by numbers and resources. And more importantly, he believed the Americans had not truly earned their victory. To him, American forces were outsiders who arrived late. They had entered the war in 1944 when Germany was already heavily damaged by years of fighting on the Eastern Front. He believed they advanced through France against weakened resistance and had never experienced the true brutality of war. He held particular contempt for General Patton. In his eyes, Patton was a media-created hero, a man of reputation rather than real suffering, someone with unlimited resources who had never faced true desperation on the battlefield. So when von Gotberg arrived at the Munich processing center on May 8th, he already intended not to cooperate peacefully. Meanwhile, George Patton was in Munich that same week overseeing the American occupation. Germany had already surrendered, and formal ceremonies were complete. However, Patton was personally inspecting operations to ensure everything was being carried out properly. While at 3rd Army headquarters, he received reports that a German general at one of the processing centers was refusing to cooperate and making hostile, inflammatory remarks. His staff suggested sending military police to handle the situation. They even recommended arresting the officer if necessary. But Patton chose a different path. He decided to go there himself. He arrived by jeep wearing full dress uniform, his 3 stars clearly visible, and his ivory-handled revolvers at his side. He entered the processing building where von Gotberg was waiting. Inside the room, the setup was simple but formal. A long table divided the 2 sides. American officers sat on one side, German officers on the other. Armed guards lined the walls, watching carefully. The surrender documents were placed in the center, waiting to be signed. Von Gotberg stood rigidly on the German side. His uniform was immaculate despite the chaos of retreat and defeat surrounding him. His Iron Cross was clearly displayed. He carried himself with the dignity of a traditional Prussian officer, completely unbroken in posture. When Patton entered, every American officer immediately stood at attention. But von Gotberg did not move. It was a deliberate insult. In military tradition, standing is a sign of respect for a superior officer. His refusal was a statement he did not recognize Patton's authority, nor did he respect him. Patton noticed immediately but said nothing. He simply walked to his side of the table and sat down. His aide began reading the surrender terms aloud. The conditions were standard. Von Gotberg was required to sign the documents, surrender his weapon, and be transported to a prisoner of war facility for processing. There was nothing unusual about it. When the reading finished, silence filled the room. Then von Gotberg spoke. He addressed Patton directly, his tone controlled but insulting. He said he had heard of Patton through newspapers, where he was described as a great warrior and brilliant commander. He said he found this amusing. He continued by stating that Germany had been fighting for 5 years across multiple fronts: Poland, France, Russia, and Africa against enemies determined to destroy them completely. He emphasized hunger, lack of fuel, absence of air support, and cities burning under constant attack. Then his tone hardened. He called the American war a wealthy man's war, saying they had unlimited supplies, air superiority, and never experienced starvation or true desperation. He said they advanced in France only after the Soviets had already broken German forces. He questioned how this could be called heroism. Finally, he looked directly at Patton and said that Americans had never faced real war like the Eastern Front. He said Patton was not a warrior but a tourist who arrived after the real fighting was already over. The room erupted in tension. American soldiers began raising their rifles again. But Patton calmly raised his hand and said, "Stop." He stood slowly, walked around the table, and stopped directly in front of von Gotberg, close enough to see every detail of his uniform and expression. Then Patton spoke quietly. He said he wanted to thank von Gotberg, because he had just given him the opportunity to say something he had been thinking for a long time. He acknowledged that the Eastern Front had been brutal and that German soldiers had fought hard. But he immediately made a distinction: fighting hard was not the same as fighting well. He explained that Germany's defeat came from poor strategic decisions, from launching a war they could not win, and from sacrificing logic for ideology. He pointed to Stalingrad and said that an army competent in strategy would never trap itself in such a position. Then he addressed von Gotberg's claim about the American war. Patton admitted it was a wealthy man's war, but explained that this was exactly why they won. War, he said, is decided by logistics, supply chains, industry, and planning, not desperation. He said Germany fought with ideology and suffering, but he fought with calculation. And calculation wins. Patton then said von Gotberg called him a tourist, but tourists know when to leave. Germany did not. They stayed in the war until their country was destroyed, their cities reduced to rubble, and their people starving. That, he said, was not courage, it was failure. He continued, saying the difference between them was simple. Patton fought to win. Von Gotberg fought to prove something. Patton protected his men. Von Gotberg sacrificed his. Patton ended the war. Germany prolonged it. Then he made the final point: history would remember the winners, not the suffering of the defeated. Patton returned to his seat and ordered von Gotberg to sign the documents. He warned that refusal would result in being dragged out and imprisoned with common soldiers. After a long pause, von Gotberg finally signed. He surrendered his weapon, removed his belt, and stood at attention, stating he was ready for transport. He was escorted out. Later, Patton commented that the man had needed to hear the truth, and that he was tired of people confusing suffering with superiority. He kept von Gotberg's pistol and sent it to West Point as a lesson in military reality. Von Gotberg spent 2 years as a prisoner of war and never publicly spoke about the encounter again. He also never again claimed German military superiority. If you were in Patton's position, facing a defeated enemy who refused to accept reality, would you stay silent or respond like he did? And before you go, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more Untold World War II stories like this.